Williams, and I'm a resident of Carrboro. Have been here since 1990, and I welcome you to this evening's presentation on an aspect of Black history or American history that I think is underappreciated, indeed underknown. When I was contacted to maybe suggest a possible topic for this evening's program, and given the broader theme of Black resistance, if I remember correctly, the Freedmen's Conventions and gatherings came to mind. And when I thought about that, I also thought about a presenter a potential presenter that I'll introduce in a minute. But before going further, I want to mention sometimes I get asked, why do you spend so much time and energy and focus on African American history? And I have my answers, but I want to have you give thought to what has been said by at least a couple of people far wiser than me or I, whatever the proper you English people would know. And one is a person that this community has for the past 10 years given attention to and focus, and that is Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, and I think this was in maybe 1888 or so, said the following: while the nation may forget, it may shut its eyes to the past and frown upon any who may do otherwise, but the colored people of this country are bound to keep the past in lively memory till justice shall be done them. I also think about a statement or a quote of James Baldwin, and he says, history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it, and in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. And we should think about that in this moment when there are forces within this country, indeed even within this state, that are seeking to suppress children and others learning this history. And there's a reason for that, which is beyond the scope of this talk. I am really pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Freddie Parker is someone that I wish I had met much earlier in life. I became aware of him probably maybe 15 or 20 years ago, but didn't have the opportunity to work with him, to get to know him, to see him work his magic until the past 10 or 15 years or so. He is a professor emeritus of history at North Carolina Central University. He has degrees, he's written books. He's a very learned person. He is indeed a scholar of the highest degree. But in my opinion, that is not the most important thing about Dr. Parker. There are a lot of professors who write well, who teach well, and who remain in the ivory towers of academia. Dr. Parker is one of these people who realizes the importance of this knowledge, this information, not just to students who are enrolled in school, but to the public at large. And he has been so generous with his time and his talent, time and time and time again. When you speak to some of these people who run some of these state historical agencies, North Carolina Museum of History, the African American Heritage Commission, Carolina Public Humanities, and Carolina K through 12 does a lot of work related to trying to get teachers equipped to address these issues I think they phrase as hard history. When you talk to any of them, to a man or woman, when you're talking about a presenter for these events, a name of Dr. Freddie Parker is probably first in their minds. He's respected throughout the state of North Carolina, and indeed even at the national level. And so I could go on and on. I could list all the commissions and committees that he's been a part of. I will mention when we here in Orange County formed the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, one of the first persons that we reached out to was Dr. Freddie Parker, and he was a key and crucial aspect of our moving that effort along and giving it traction and giving it credibility. So without further ado, I introduce my friend, Dr. Freddie Parker.
Good evening. And thank you, James, for that really kind introduction. I continue to appreciate the tenacity and the fortitude that Attorney James Williams displays in our community daily, working diligently to keep the history of Black folk on the front burner. I refer to him as the ambassador of information and of programming. And to all of you intrepid ambassadors in the struggle to attain complete freedom, justice, and equality, using any and all means at your disposal, I say to you, keep on keeping on. As many of you may know, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History for decades now has taken on the responsibility of deciding on the annual theme for Black History Month. The association was founded in 1915 by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Woodson and others established Negro History Day in 1926. It later grew into Negro History Week, and for more than 40 years now, the entire month is celebrated. A year after establishing the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, Dr. Woodson founded the Journal of Negro History for the dissemination of research on Black people. That journal is now the Journal of African American History. This year's theme is Black Resistance, Past, Present, and Future. This theme coincides with our discussion tonight. The Freedmen's Conventions held in Raleigh in September 1865, just after the end of slavery, and again in October 1866. These meetings continued the blueprint that had been established by organizations founded by Blacks for nearly 100 years. And when we explore the efforts of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and James Forten, just to name a few, and those nameless free Blacks who fought in the mid to late 19th century to end slavery and the dehumanizing slave trade, and those who struggled to secure more rights for free Blacks. We're looking at resistance when we explore what these men and women did. But it didn't begin there. This has been an ongoing struggle from the time that Europeans began robbing the African continent of its human resource. Black folk have been struggling and resisting. A classic example is that of Queen Nzinga, who led her armies against the Portuguese during much of the 17th century in what we now call Angola. Nzinga's struggles for decades served as a catalyst for those who continued to fight the Portuguese until independence was gained in 1975. There were rebellions aboard the slave trading vessels en route to the Americas, and more than 200 slave insurrections and rebellions occurred in colonial America and in the United States between 1619 and 1865. Enslaved men, women, and children resisted by running away and committing day-to-day acts of resistance to escape the horrors of their enslavement. That struggle, that resistance continues right down to the present time. When 200 years of legalized slavery ended in the spring of 1865, Black folks right here in North Carolina, probably some of your ancestors, banded together by the summer of 1865 and began discussing their plight, their future after slavery. How do we transition from slavery to freedom? Do we demand the ballot or ask for the ballot? Do we demand or ask for land? Do we ask for a seat at the proverbial table of brotherhood and the literal table where we sit and eat anywhere our money will take us? Do we demand to be taught to read and write in the classroom where white kids read and write? Do we demand access to public accommodations, ride on trains, live in your hotels, and most importantly, do we demand a piece of land to cultivate? I'm not asking for the 50 or the 100 acres or the 500 acres you gave to colonial settlers, homesteaders, and the 90 million acres of land taken from the Native Americans under the Dawes Act of 1887 and distributed to whites. That is white affirmative action and is the premise upon which the nation was founded. All I'm saying is that if you just give me 40 acres and a mule, I'll be satisfied for a while. But let's start there. 40 acres and a mule will do. And so these men who met in New Bern in August 1865 issued a call to other black men to join them in Raleigh, North Carolina in September. Their selection of September 29th, 1865 was not just some arbitrary date, for they knew that President Andrew Johnson had instructed all governors of the seceded states to hold a state convention to first of all eliminate or confirm the state's abolishment of slavery, and even acknowledge that seceding from the United States in 1861 was an illegal act. William W. Holden had been appointed by President Johnson to serve as provisional governor of North Carolina. This meeting of black men on September 29th, 1865, was known as the Freedmen's Convention. They consciously wanted to upstage the state convention down the street from them in Raleigh. They wanted state convention attendees and Governor Holden to know what they wanted as newly freed people. The Freedmen's Convention convened on September 29, 1865, at St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church in downtown Raleigh. 3 days before the state convention began, that state convention began to write or rewrite the Constitution. With more than 100 black delegates in attendance from counties primarily in Eastern and Piedmont, North Carolina, the convention began. James Walker Hood from New Bern was elected president of the convention. Hood, a bishop in the AME Church, had been active in the fight for black civil rights, for black human rights in the North for many years. He said to his fellow delegates, quote, "We and the white people have to live here together. Some people talk of immigration for the black race, some of expatriation, and some of colonization. I regard this as all nonsense. We have been living together for 100 years and more, and we have got to live together still. And the best way is to harmonize our feelings as much as possible and to treat all men respectfully." Abraham Galloway, James Harris, a local black citizen, and other delegates made speeches during the 4-day convention. All speeches were related to attaining first-class citizenship. As with any assemblage of human beings, there were different views and an expression of avenues to take to secure agreed upon objectives. Some delegates believed that blacks should not fight to secure the ballot. Others believed that they needed to be careful and not ask for the right to serve on juries when a white person was charged with a crime. While others believed that the convention should be, in effect, very nice, kind, and gentle when approaching whites for their rights. These differences of opinion and approach undoubtedly led to healthy debate over several days. The delegates understood that their efforts could not end with a one-time convention. So while in session, they decided to establish an organization through which they could advance the goals of the convention and their future goals. That organization was the North Carolina State Equal Rights League. They would achieve their objectives, quote, by political and moral means, as far as may be the repeal of all laws and parts of laws, state and national, which make distinctions on account of color, unquote. Their immediate goals were access to the ballot box, the right to testify in court against whites, and to serve as jurors. The delegates left the meeting hopeful, but within a few months, their hopes and dreams were deferred because by the end of March 1866, the North Carolina legislature had passed a series of laws known as the Black Codes. North Carolina followed the course of Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, and the other southern states when they instituted laws that were similar to the slave codes. 9 laws were proposed, including a ban on interracial marriages. Vagrancy laws were put in place to restrict the movement of the formerly enslaved. There was a ban on carrying weapons without a license. The rape of a white woman by a black man was punishable by death. For a white man, the sentence was 2 years and a public whipping. Limits on blacks testifying against whites in court and apprentice laws were put in place for children. In April 1866, the Civil Rights Bill was passed over President Johnson's veto, the very first Civil Rights Bill passed in this country, 1866. Johnson believed that too many rights for black people would lead to an Africanization of the South. His words, that black folks would actually Africanize the South. The Civil Rights Bill did 2 important things. One, it made the formerly enslaved citizens of the United States and of the states in which they were born. Secondly, the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 overturned the Black Codes. However, that was short-lived. As Southern states were redeemed, they again instituted laws that were akin to the slave and Black codes. And many of these laws stayed in place all the way down to the 1960s. With such a white backlash to the 13th Amendment that had been ratified in December 1865, and President Johnson's continued support of the former Confederates, because he believed that blacks were innately and inherently inferior to whites, and that essentially, this is what he said, the lowest white man in the social hierarchy should be above the highest black man. President Andrew Johnson. The leaders of the Freedmen's Convention in 1865, who were now leaders of the Equal Rights League, decided on another convention and set the date for October 2nd through the 5th, 1866. 115 delegates representing 60 counties in North Carolina assembled again at the St. Paul AME Church in Raleigh. And we're fortunate to have the minutes of those proceedings. After electing officers, appointing committees, committee chairs, sergeants at arms, and taking care of other convention business, the first session began on the morning of October 2nd. Delegates invited several white leaders, including Governor Holden, Thomas Bragg, who was a former governor, a U.S. senator, and who eventually was part of the team that successfully prosecuted Governor Holden, leading to his impeachment and conviction in 1870. William A. Graham, a former governor, U.S. senator. I think you can go on campus of UNC Chapel Hill and see the name William Graham, a North Carolina House member who represented Orange County between 1833 and 1840, and a member of the prosecuting team that convicted Governor Holden. And the convention invited Bartholomew F. Moore, an attorney who served as state attorney general and state representative. Most turned down the invitation to speak to the delegates, but Governor Holden did speak to the group. In summary, this is what he said. The general good feeling between the two races in this state should be cultivated and strengthened. This was the home of the black man as well as of the white man. The two races should, he said, mutually sustain each other. The black man needed the knowledge the white man had of the arts and sciences and of history and government. He was also dependent on the white man for lands and houses. The white race needed the black as aids in cultivating and improving the country. They might also be needed to defend the country, that is, blacks, against foreign foes. They should be the man in reliance, so portions of the state in producing the great staples. The first care of the black people should be to procure homes, no matter how cheap or small. To do this, they must be industrious, temperate, and economical. Labor was the first great consideration. They had no time to waste at public gatherings. They should, rather than gather themselves at the public gatherings, they should not congregate in the towns in greater numbers than might be necessary for business. In other words, get off the streets. And they should avoid all temptations to idleness and dissipation. The first thing was to get homes, and the next was, while they still labor to improve and add to their possessions, to educate their children. Education was good for all races and color. Knowledge is power. As a general rule, people were virtuous and useful in proportion as they were educated, and vicious and useless in the world when sunk deep in ignorance. W.W. Holden. It was evident by October 1866 that the delegates continued to push for civil and human rights through legislation and the courts. But what seemed to have dominated the deliberations were discussions about the safety and the security of black North Carolinians. The Freedmen's Bureau, as well as citizens across the state, had begun to report the atrocities being committed by whites against blacks throughout the state. Nearly 30 lynchings of black men had occurred by the start of the convention in October 1866. The following resolution attests to the urgency of the moment. Be it resolved, this is in the convention, that the colored people in every county, district, and village throughout the state form themselves into auxiliary leagues, which leagues must be connected with the state organization, its bureau to be located in Raleigh, North Carolina, and whose duty it shall be to receive reports of outrages from auxiliary leagues or from the people of said counties, and communicate them to headquarters and such newspapers through the county as it may deem proper, so that the government and the world may know of the cruelties inflicted upon us and the disadvantages under which we labor, that we earnestly protest against such violations and will do all in our power to prevent its further continuation. The delegates drew up a resolution which endorsed the Freedmen's Bureau. They supported, obviously, the ratification of the 13th Amendment and the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. A portion of the resolution called on the United States Congress to enact legislation to protect equally rights of all American people without regard to race or color. And the delegates maintained that those of you, talking to whites, who live in the former Confederate states regard taxation without representation as unjust. We do too. And such is directly in violation of our sacred rights as American citizens. Under the Black Codes, apprenticeship laws were established, allowing whites to take the children of former enslaved people and, in effect, use them as slaves. The delegates drew up the following resolution to bring attention to this problem. It says, whereas in and through the counties of the state, our children, the dearest ties of which binds us to domestic life, and which makes the ties of home endearing, are ruthlessly taken from us and bound out without our consent. Therefore, be it resolved that it shall be the duty of every member of the convention on returning home to form or cause to be formed an equal rights league in or near the place wherein such member shall reside, and to do all in his power to promote their increase throughout other portions of his county. In a resolution, delegates encouraged Black people to respect and patronize each other in their various businesses. And finally, they saluted individuals like Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, a leading champion of Black rights. They supported or saluted Thaddeus Stevens, a congressman from Pennsylvania and staunch supporter of Blacks, and especially the fact that Stevens wanted to distribute land to the ex-slaves. Stevens was also one of the chief architects of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and led the charge to actually impeach Andrew Johnson. They also offered their thanks to Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett, who they said were the beacon lights of the Black race. The delegates to the Freedmen's Convention in October 1866 also believed that education was one of the keys to Black success. And so they established what was called the Freedmen's Educational Association of North Carolina to aid in the establishment of schools for freedmen and others, regardless of race or color. I think that most observers of the four-day convention would agree that the delegates who assembled in Raleigh for the convention were rather meek, mild, and really non-demanding. The following resolution to the Black and white citizens of North Carolina, I think, is a testimony to this. It says, fellow citizens, can we look to you for protection or not, to shield us from the murderous hand? O humanity, where is thy blush? Our defenseless wives and children, fathers, sons, and brothers are beaten with clubs, robbed, shot, and killed in various localities, and the authorities regard it not. We beg you as white men in authority to shield our defenseless heads and guard our little homes We appeal to your religion and humanity. We claim by merit the right of suffrage and ask it at your hands. We believe the day has come when black men have rights which white men are bound to respect. We intend to live and die on the soil which gave us birth. O North Carolina, the land of our birth, with all thy faults, we love thee still. Will you, oh, will you treat us as human beings with all our rights? It is all we ask. We are your humble servants in behalf of the state's Equal Rights League. Many of the Equal Rights League leaders went on to become politicians at the local, state, and national levels, fighting for the rights articulated in the Freedmen's Convention. As early as 1867, Johnson had lost his bid to control Reconstruction. That is President Johnson. It was now in the hands of Congress. On March 2nd, 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts that turned things around in North Carolina and throughout the South. The South was placed under military rule and divided into 5 military districts. North Carolina and South Carolina were placed in District 2, a general presiding over each district. The Tenure of Office Act and the Command of the Army Act stripped President Johnson of some of his powers and set him up for impeachment when he violated those laws. Now under the military rule, the South had to rewrite their constitutions, ratify the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and allow black men the right to vote for delegates to the Constitutional Convention. So in the November 1867 election, 120 delegates were elected to write the state's new constitution. 13 black Republicans representing 19 counties were elected to rewrite the state's constitution. Among these leaders were Bishop James Walker Hood, Abraham Galloway, Clifton Pearson, James Harris, John Hyman, who went on to serve 4 terms as a state senator and as a U.S. congressman, representing the 2nd congressional district in North Carolina, represented by such counties as Bertie, Hertford, Edgecombe, Northampton, Halifax, all having substantial black majority populations. The Constitutional Convention opened on January 14th, 1868. Relatively speaking, the new Constitution was progressive, and the black presence played a major role in this new Constitution. The new Constitution provided for universal suffrage for blacks and whites, black men and white men. Judges were to be elected rather than appointed. Public beatings and hangings ended as punishment for crimes. A system of penitentiaries was established to confine and rehabilitate criminals. A board of public charities was established. A general and uniform system of education was established that is free public education, supported by tax dollars. A very progressive constitution, relatively speaking. However, opposition to the new Constitution was swift and immediate. A tremendous white backlash. Opposition to the convention, the presence of troops, because under the Reconstruction Act of 1867, troops were sent down into North Carolina and the other 9 states, and among those troops were large numbers of black troops, and for whites to see the presence of black troops just did something to them. So the 15th Amendment, all of these were accented by the adoption of this new Constitution. The Ku Klux Klan grew in North Carolina after the new Constitution and the election results of 1868. It was difficult for many whites to stomach the election of 3 black men to the North Carolina Senate in 1868. Senators Henry Epps of Halifax County, Abraham Galloway of New Hanover, and John Hyman of Warren County were those 3 blacks who went to the North Carolina State Senate in 1868. Those individuals, 18 House members, were elected. Those, in addition to those individuals, including individuals like Parker D. Robbins, Wilson Carey, John Leary, Isham Sweat, Henry Cherry. In 2023, this year, we have 9 black senators and about 25 House of Representatives members in the North Carolina General Assembly. 21 in 1868, 34, 158 years later. With the growth of the Klan came violence. At its height, the Klan boasted 40,000 members in North Carolina. And although the Klan could be found throughout North Carolina, it was most powerful in the Piedmont, especially Orange County, right here where we are, Caswell and Alamance counties. Between 1868 and 1870, more than 20 murders were committed by the Klan in North Carolina, for those, or for which we have some corroboration of information. There were probably many, many more. There were also whippings, clubbings, and beatings. The best known of these murders was that of Wyatt Outlaw, a black man who lived in Graham, North Carolina, Alamance County. He was head of the Union League. On the night of February 26, 1870, a group of about 100 men raided Outlaw's home and lynched him. From an elm tree facing the county courthouse, and pinned to his chest was a note: "Beware you guilty, both white and black." The second notable killing was that of John W. Stevens, a white Republican state senator and Union Leaguer from Caswell County. He was sentenced to death by the Ku Klux Klan and killed in the Caswell County courthouse on May 21st, 1870, 3 months after Outlaw was killed. So how do we assess the Freedmen's Conventions and the Equal Rights League of the 1860s and their impact on the struggle for black civil and human rights? These organizations placed the agenda of black folks on the table in 1865 and 1866. Access to the ballot, the right to serve on juries, and to testify against whites who fought a daily fight to return the formerly enslaved to a state of slavery, using any means at their disposal. They fought for an end to apprenticeship laws. They pushed for an allocation of abandoned lands for the former slaves. That is the 40 acres and a mule concept. They cried out to authorities to do something about the daily atrocities heaped upon black folks. The conventions launched the careers of several men who continued the struggle and resistance to oppression well into the 20th century. John Hyman and James O'Hara served in the House of Representatives in Washington during Reconstruction and beyond. And between 1868 and 1900, more than 100 blacks served in the North Carolina General Assembly. The agenda set by the Freedmen's Conventions and the work of these formerly enslaved and free black men to secure greater measures of freedom, unfortunately, remain in many ways on the table today. Thank you.
I wanted to see if you would entertain a few questions or comments from our audience. Any questions? Anyone?
Or comments?
Or comments? Yes. Mr. Fushi.
The what movement? All of this stuff is so inextricably tied. All of it's inextricably tied together. You know, it's amazing when you go back and look at these individuals who were fighting in 1865, 1866, through the 1870s. These are some of the same people who were involved in the struggle and in the 1880s, 1890s. They become the fusionists. They're still working in the Republican Party. Um, by the time we get to 1898, 1900, what had been, at one time, I guess it must have been down in Raleigh, there were 21 people in the General Assemblies, 21 blacks, but all of that came to an end in 1900. I think most of us know what happened in 1898 with the white supremacy campaign and the fact that black people were disfranchised in 1900. George H. White was the last of the black congressmen from the South, and black, period. That term ended in 1901. Nobody went back until 1928. There were no black representatives from North Carolina until, I guess it was 1992, when Eva Clayton was elected. Uh, there was a constant struggle on the part of the former Confederates to ensure that a state of slavery remained. When you look around today, it's so sad that in 2023, we look back 100 years, 115, 130 years ago, and you're fighting the same fight. One of the things that stood out in that second convention especially was the fact that the delegates talked about the atrocities being committed by the state and by individuals. The Ku Klux Klan didn't come into play until 1868 in North Carolina, even though it was founded in 1866. Didn't really have a great impact on North Carolina until 1868, after that election, after that constitutional convention. But they are absolutely saying what we're saying today about police brutality. How people are targeted for one reason, and that's the color of your skin. I mean, you are absolutely, if I'm riding down the street and I'm pulled over, it's because of profiling. I mean, it's already been documented that is definitely one of the primary reasons folks are pulled over. But the same thing happened in 1865, in 1868, 1870, 1898. So the struggle, the resistance, the struggle absolutely continues right down to the present time. And the sad part about it is that we're talking about the very same issues. In 1900, they tried to disfranchise you. In 1870, they disfranchised you. And in 2020, they're doing the same thing. 2023, I just look around and we see that the number of black General Assembly members from the eastern counties, we're talking about those counties that at one time were in District 2, Congressional District 2. I named them: Halifax, Edgecombe, Hereford, Perquimans, Pasquotank. These were some of your majority black counties. And what happened in November? They could not send blacks who had been in the House of Representatives and the Senate, been there for years and years, couldn't send them back because of years of gerrymandering, rewriting the lines so that you water down districts to the extent that you can't send a black there. And then apathy, the fact that folks don't get out to vote, money not put into the districts. Like, for one thing, I think the Democratic Party may have taken those counties for granted. They're going to vote. But so you don't come to my town to ask me to vote, to tell me that you need my support. And so not putting time, attention, money in those eastern counties, I think, was definitely a factor in losing representation in the General Assembly.
So, and I'm going to throw a question in myself. You mentioned one of the things that the Freedmen's Convention delegates were fighting for was addressing this issue of apprenticeship, where black kids were being taken from their parents and, in essence, returned to an enslaved condition, pretty much on the whim of whatever white person, usually I think a former enslaver, decided appropriate. And I'm thinking about this whole concept of family and people trying to reconstitute families, and the fact that there were probably quite a few female-headed households. And my guess is that by definition, if it was a female-headed household, that there were those who thought that in and of itself gave them the right to apprentice the children or certain children within that that household. Could you talk a bit about, how life on the ground for the newly freed slaves, played out, and why it was so critical that those delegates at the convention try to find a remedy to address that?
It's a very good question because I think we don't really hone in on the day-to-day experiences of people after slavery. I mean, for example, where did those black delegates who went to Raleigh in 1865 and 1866, where did they live? Where did they stay? Was there a nice black hotel there in Raleigh in 1865? I think the first one didn't come until about 1921. They're actually living in the homes of other black people. They're actually, as they drove their when there was not a home available to them. There are a few stories of some women, some black women who had just gotten tired of these guys just living in their home and asking their husbands, can't you do something else? Can't you just build a little house over here for them? I mean, something as simple as that. So my point here is, what were the day-to-day conditions on the ground? And I think we don't think about, for example, the health of these men, women, and children who are coming out of enslavement. You got to also remember that many of them are still living on the farms and plantations they've been living on for generations. We can go to the 1930s, and when you look at the Works Project Administration papers, when some of those former slaves were actually interviewed in 1930, 1935, they're still living 60 years later on the plantation of the farm that they were on when they were actually enslaved. So, what are the conditions? Essentially, we have a condition that is very akin to slavery still after 1865. I mean, for example, how many of you are familiar with sharecropping, tenant farming? I mean, sharecropping was nothing but slavery. And 100 years after slavery ended, in many ways, it was nothing but slavery. I have a personal experience. My father, who was born and raised in northern Orange County, wanted his sons to experience sharecropping. So at 10 years of age, he takes us out into Cedar Grove, North Carolina, and we have the sharecropping experience. And I guarantee you that sharecropping experience that we had was akin to what it was 50, 80 years earlier, because what it meant back in the 19th century was that the man is supplying everything. He's supplying a place for you to live. He's supplying all the materials for the final product, for the tobacco, for the cotton, whatever is grown. And at the end of the harvest season, he would say, well, we broke even. So what money did I actually get? And so my father, we lived in a 3-room shack. We moved from Hillsboro, where we had running water and inside bath, to the country where we had a 3-room shack and an outside toilet. But he wanted his boys to experience that kind of life. And as it turns out, when the man, as we called him, sold that first load of tobacco, this is 1963, he made what my father believed was $700 because he gave my father $350. Well, the man had a son my age, and the son told me that, yeah, daddy sold that tobacco and made $1,400. Well, I was 10 and I knew that 350 was not half of 1,400. And so my father, I told my father about that, and he went to the man with his hand in his pocket with his knife open. And after the man explained to him that, well, you're living in my house. I gave you molasses. I gave you flour. You borrowed money from me. And so that's why I gave you $350. And when December rolled around and it was time for us to move back to Hillsboro, he may have gotten a few more $100. But sharecropping in 1870, 1880 was akin to the institution of slavery. And so when you look on a daily basis, it was easy for the former slave owners to take children, not only children, but adults too, and re-enslave them. And when you look at pockets of North Carolina, we see that re-enslavement on a daily basis. That's why I encourage students who are writing master's theses and dissertations and even beyond, try to do the research on those day-to-day conditions. It takes more work, it takes more research, but try to find out what was the health like of black folks coming out of slavery. I mean, what about the fact that one of the black codes indicated that all of those black folks who were married by jumping the broom, you ever thought about what happened to those marriages? Well, if you don't get married in North Carolina in 1866, then you're living, yeah. I mean, you have to get married. So, and if you are not married, then you got to pay a fine. Uh, So, what about the marriages on a daily basis? What about life on a daily basis for the ex-slaves? And I think the convention, the delegates to the convention, obviously because they were on the ground and understood what was happening to their people on a daily basis, tried to put this stuff on the front burner. And I never want to say they failed, but in terms of achieving those objectives that were placed on the table from the outset, I mean, we just didn't achieve those. And in many ways, we still have not achieved those. But what I look at is the gut, tenacity, fortitude, determination. Can you imagine leaving Elizabeth City, North Carolina? Back during those days, we didn't have fast transportation like we have today. But riding horseback all the way to Raleigh, leaving New Bern, North Carolina, leaving Wilmington, coming to Raleigh, fighting for a right to first-class citizenship. It's something that you really have to pay attention to and absolutely applaud. People who were absolutely trying to be free. And then on the other hand, the backlash that continued on a daily basis. If you ever get a chance, look at the atrocities records maintained by the Freedmen's Bureau in all of the southern states. It's heartbreaking to see, for example, that a group of people go into a cabin in Moore County, North Carolina, for no reason and just simply kill all five of the people who lived there. And one of those who was arrested, one of the whites who was arrested, said yes, boasting that there was a little baby there. He was crying and going on, so I took my heel and kicked the life out of him. You know, uh, these kinds of atrocities occurred almost daily. We look at lynching, and lynching brings attention, but the daily atrocities, the daily killings, didn't bring that kind of attention. And so when you began to count the number of people killed throughout the South between 1866 and about 1871, the time that the enforcement acts were passed, we're talking about 5,000 people that we know about that were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of White Camellia, the rifle associations of South Carolina, Louisiana. There were a lot of local organizations established too that never became national. And then we have to also, the number of people killed by those organizations was probably small relative to the individuals who killed other individuals on a daily basis. I'm not associated with any organization. I'm just killing people as an individual. And so when these kids are actually re-enslaved, because that's exactly what it was, we're looking at something that's akin to the penal system as well. I mean, you have people who are imprisoned for committing the slightest. I'm talking about an offense that was not an offense 2 years ago. It becomes an offense so that you can put the individual in prison so that you can then contract that individual out to work for somebody. And as the warden, I get a kickback for that. So how many people in the South, were actually put in the system, in the penal system, and never made it out, who may have been killed by a former slave owner or a former Confederate, I should say. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, James, but
You did. You did. And gave us a lot more. We got a lot of bang for that buck. So I appreciate it. Any other questions? Because I've got one. I mean, I don't want to take up the space, but while you all are thinking about it, I was in Raleigh last week. It was a case that was before the North Carolina Supreme Court, CSI versus Moore, and it related to felon disfranchisement. You know, if you've been convicted of a felony in the state of North Carolina, and even though you're released from prison, if you haven't done X, Y, Z, including pay every dime that they say you owe restitution, thank you, then you're deprived of the right to vote. Now, and that didn't just happen. One of the things that I did not know is that after the Civil War, after the passage of the 15th Amendment, it may have even started prior to the 15th Amendment. There were certain practices and procedures put in place with the intent purpose of making sure of suppressing the right of the newly enslaved to vote. And there was testimony by, I forget this historian from South Carolina, that in North Carolina, one of the things that people began to do, usually the sheriffs, law enforcement, was public whippings of the formerly enslaved, because that was an indication that a so-called infamous crime had been committed. So they'd come up with a reason to whip you, and the mere fact that you were whipped by the, quote, law served as a barrier to your being able to vote. So here again, we're talking about something put in place, of course, then there were laws passed also, put in place way back then. The consequences today are, is that, proportionately, more black people are deprived of the right to the ballot. And that was the plan with this disfranchisement. And then also in Raleigh, gerrymandering. You just talked about that. You got these two cases that the newly constituted state Supreme Court, now that they have the votes, they're going to reach back down and undo decisions that the Supreme Court decided just last year. So they are ignoring this concept of precedent, So it's like a repeat cycle. Anyhow, that wasn't so much a question, just a comment. But if you,
no, but that's fine.
you've always got the right to the mic. So
when we have these kinds of discussions, I try to leave folk with something that's positive, because all of that was ugly. That's ugly. The fact that there were all of these attempts to maintain the status quo, to maintain slavery. I mean, it's been in place for 200 years in North Carolina. I mean, slavery was legalized in North Carolina as early as 1663, when King Charles II allowed for the establishment of the colony. And it ends in 1865. So 200 years of legalized slavery in North Carolina. That's ugly. And so people wanted to hold on to that. They just didn't want to let it go. And so when we look at all of that ugliness, when we look at the fact that as early as 1865, 1866, there were all these race riots, the Colfax murders down in Louisiana, the 1898 Wilmington slaughter. We call it a race riot. It was not a race riot by any means. It was a murder, the murder of people, the loss of land. I mean, for example, just go and look at the population, the black population of New Hanover County in 1840, 1850, and 1860, and look at it in 2020. When at one time the population of New Hanover County was about 62%, it is now 21%. And much of that had to do with the fact that people were forced out of North Carolina, down in Wilmington, land taken. Okay, can you imagine when you look, for example, at the Tulsa race war that took place, the slaughter in 1921, and all of the wealth that was in the black community that was taken from them, and how the generational wealth was taken from them? I just take your hotel from you. I take your business from you. I destroy your economic infrastructure completely, which means that your children won't have the same kind of opportunity that my children have. I mentioned, for example, the fact that black folks were asking for 40 acres and a mule. I mean, they just weren't saying, give me 40 acres and a mule. There was a tradition of people getting land. I mean, the premise upon which we operated in colonial America was we're given head rights. If you came to Virginia from England in 1640, or you came to North Carolina in 1680, what do you have? Nothing, except that somebody is giving you 50 acres of land, 100 acres of land. Do you know that there are people in eastern North Carolina today who own thousands of acres of land, who can trace that generational land ownership back to head rights? You understand that? That's generational wealth. You're given 100 acres of land, and now you have 5,000 acres because of what was given to you in 1680. The same thing with folks in Delaware and Virginia, in Massachusetts and other places. Head rights were important. That's how you got started. And then you have homesteaders. I mean, look at 1785, 1787, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Northwest Ordinances. Folks who are leaving the eastern part of the country going to the western part of the country, how do they make it? Except that they're given land or given land at a very, very cheap price, 5 cents an acre, 10 cents an acre. Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, people are absolutely getting this affirmative action. That's affirmative action. People moving out to California in 1848 and 1849, they ain't moving out there to live where? The rancheros, they're getting land. They get land. Homesteading in the 1860s. The Morrill Act of 1862, it didn't give land to individuals, but it gave land to states based on the number of House of Representatives members you have and senators you have. So there's an NC State University in Raleigh as a result of that. And thankfully, there's an A&T State University in Greensboro as a result of the second act of 1890. But my point here is that there's this huge tradition of handouts, of affirmative action. A student of mine wrote a book entitled Affirmative Action in the United States, 1619 to 2000. And what he's doing is looking at handouts. And so when we talk about the welfare system that developed in the 1930s and surely in the 1960s with welfare and handouts, so to speak. We have a tradition of that. We have a tradition. And if black folks in 1865, if every head of household had been given land and the means to cultivate that land, it would be an altogether different ball game with regard to the history of black folks in the United States. Because, I mean, they have the right to sit beside somebody on a toilet seat. They have the right to drink from the same fountain, to the right to vote, all well and good, but you don't have a place to live after you go somewhere and vote. So the failure of Reconstruction was that the system did not put into place an economic infrastructure of support. Dr. King said it. He said, how can y'all give all of this land and then in 1865 not give 1 acre to black folks? And then, 1880, black people did own about 15 million acres of land in the South. 15 million acres. By 1974, that 15 million acres had become 6 acres. And the prognosis was in 1974 that by the year 2000, blacks would be a landless people. And, and I think that has become a reality. I think was 1 million acres of land is owned by farmers. I mean, we know why people lost land. Land was taken from them. People said, I'm getting the hell out of North Carolina. I'm going to sell it for 5 cents an acre. I just want a bus ticket or a train ticket to get out of South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama. I'm going to Chicago. I'm going to Detroit. I'm going to New Jersey. I'm going to Connecticut. And they sold their land. And people just lost land. And people, of course, sold land. But let me say this. And I guess we'll call it an evening, maybe. But in the face of all of this, there is the black church. There are black institutions. By the time we get to 1880, 1890, I know a lot of people have problems with Booker T. Washington, but Booker T. Washington began preaching self-sufficiency. He began to talk about black enterprise, black economic development. Not only that, but on the social level, you won't allow us to have our join your law organization, so we create our own. We have a few black doctors, but you won't allow us to be a part of your association, so we create our own. Black fraternities, black organizations. So there was an institutional and organizational structure put in place, especially after the 1880s, that said, despite all of this, we are going to have agency. We're going to be actors rather than reactors. And so we're going to have our own funeral homes. We're going to have our own schools. In 1900, there were 20,000 black businesses in the United States. By 1914, 14 years later, there were 40,000 black businesses. And so folks are not just sitting around saying, oh, we so bad off. People are actually using their institutions, creating their institutions, creating their organizations to say we will survive. You might not allow us to be a part of you, but we will have our own. And so you have these insurance companies and these funeral homes and fraternal organizations emerging. So while on the one hand, you're looking at all of the drudgery and the ugliness, but on the other hand, well, actually hand in hand, people are fighting and struggling and resisting and building at the same time. And that continues right down to the present time.
So less, and I might add also creating beautiful culture and art. Whoever saw the Grammys last night, hey, a lot of all that creativity came out of the struggle. So it's a beautiful thing, even the struggle. Uh, but let us give a round of applause to Dr. Parker for this amazing presentation tonight. Thank you so much. Are we done? Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for attending. You've been a gracious audience. Well, you knocked another one out the park.
Trying to. Trying to. Yeah, man. I hope I answered your question. You did. Okay. You did.